Timmy, come. Timmy.
Dean said the affidavit was, quote, not the quality of writing he would expect from a fully developed police department, and that he...
Hey guys, interesting words, right? Not the quality of writing that you'd expect from a fully fledged police department. I find that definitely quite interesting, like the whole idea of we're going to talk about quality of writing in terms of the affidavit, and who better to talk about, to sort of discuss the whole idea of writing quality than a writer, right? So that is kind of what you're going to be dealing with, the quality of writing of the affidavit, the allegations made in the affidavit. So the how can I put it, the basis for the analysis today is going to be less on the transcript. We may get to the transcript, but it's going to be more dealing with the motion today and the discussion today in court, and sort of what happened regarding that. So that's what we're going to be looking at. Mel Stiller says poor quality of writing. So what we want to think about critically is the quality of writing critical after all? So let's do a quick poll. Do you think the quality of writing is poor? Yes or no? What do you guys say? While we're doing that, Terry, good to see you. You've just popped up. Mel Stiller, Stephanie, Sharon Drury, all the usual suspects, Paddy. Anyone else? Well, if you're here, make sure you say you're here, unless you are hovering and intending not to say you're here. By the way, Timmy's, thanks, Timmy, you've actually brought me into focus. Timmy's had a bit of a shave, so he is looking a little bit different. He's now in the senior homes persona. I'm not terribly happy with Timmy because I've been pulling ticks off myself, around about 10 ticks already, as a result of visiting a area that's quite a wilderness area. And although he had a lot of fun, I've had to buy him some anti-tick tablets. They're pretty expensive, and then also make sure that he's shaved so that if ticks do jump on him, they're easy to take off. So Timmy, say hi. Timmy is looking quite sharp, looking quite well groomed compared to how it normally looks. So anyway, there we go. Double Rainbow says, I cannot give any information, so I won't vote at all. I have to educate myself first. That's not a bad way to do it. You can vote at the end of the show. 10 ticks is a lot. Okay. Lisa Stokes, good to see you. Eileen, good to see you. So if you haven't said hi to chat, make sure that you do. Marcus Haysom, always good to see you as well. SW Firefly, yeah, all the usual suspects. So let's just take away that comment, but I'm going to find it to hide it. Okay, there we go. So we are going to go through the events of today, and we are going to also go into intertextuality, but affidavit intertextuality. We're going to look at the criticisms of this affidavit, and we're going to compare it to other affidavits that we know very well, like the Chris Watts affidavit, also the Barry Morphy affidavit, right? And then we're going to try and make up our minds, stay curious and make up our minds and try and see, okay, does the defense have a point? And if so, what sort of point do they have, right? that's really what you're trying to do here. So there have been a couple of headlines today. The video I've just posted, you can watch the whole thing at that link if you haven't already. Then, oh, by the way, if you don't have a TCRS notebook, make sure you get one. I think I've just put a link to the notebook on Twitter if you're interested in buying one. But then what I think is a fantastic, another fantastic article, not so much that one, not that that's not a good article, but a very good article covering this is from the Austin American Statesman. I think I first got to sign in. Let me just do that quickly. I hope you guys are all well. I hope it's going to allow me to sign in without any problems. Cool. Looks so far so good. Yeah, this article, very well written article, and you can see it's dealing with this idea of sloppy police work. It's written by Katie Hall. It is behind a paywall, but if you can possibly read it, do yourself a favor. It's got some really good analysis, right? So what I'm kind of going to do is I'm going to break down a lot of Katie Hall's observations in court, and then, as I said, we're going to look at some intertextuality, right? Stephanie, I hope you have a good sleep. Stephanie says, just wanted to say a quick hello. We'll catch up with you Peaches in the morning. Take care. Thanks for the quick hello. I hope you have a good sleep and a good Tuesday. Okay. Sharon says, I'm not on Twitter. Well, what can I do? I'll have to show you the. If Stephanie's still there, can you get the link on Twitter for that notebook and maybe just post it onto chat? Stephanie, if you're still watching. Terry, if you're still watching, maybe you can do that. Otherwise, we'll just put the link to the notebook in the comments afterwards. Anyway, let's get going. So there was in the beginning a little bit of what's the word, mystery. I certainly didn't know. So there was a witness. There was somebody who testified today. Does anyone know who it was? So I don't know if any of you are ahead of the news. Do you know who testified and what today was all about in the Austin court? There were a couple of thoughts. There was a couple of what's the word, alternatives. We knew that Spitler and Connor had already been called. I thought, could there have been a ballistics expert called? Also, could you have had one of those anonymous callers called, right? Does anyone know who was ultimately called? Well, Ricardo says she's stuck in Dallas Airport. Well, I hope this is going to help you pass the time. Paddy says, I hope you're not stuck for too long. Does anyone know the witness that was called and that testified today? Because that's what we're going to be dealing with. Terry says, I don't know. Marcus, that's honest of you, says, I read Patreon, so I saw it. So it's actually a former lieutenant from the Plano Police Department. I think it is, let me see if I can just find that information. What did I do? Oh, I think it's on a different sort of, let me just bring it up quickly. It was actually this guy. That is Lieutenant Deaton. That's him there on the left. his name is Doug Deaton, and he retired just more than a year ago on June 30th, 2021. And there's a little bit of background on the witness that was on the stand today, testifying as an expert defense witness, right? So it says here, after graduating from South Garland High School, Lieutenant Deaton attended the University of North Texas. He earned a Bachelor of Science in Criminal Justice. Then he worked as a police officer and firefighter for the Highland Park Department of Public Safety. He's earned a Master Peace Officer certification and then all sorts of other things, and so on and so on. During his employment at Plano Police Department, he worked in the Patrol Services Division, the Criminal Investigation Services Division. He was a member of the SWAT team, where he received numerous awards representing the department. I don't see anything about being a detective or a homicide investigator. Maybe I'm missing something, but it says in 2005 he was nominated as the Employee of the Year, and then he was a finalist for the Plano Police Department Supervisor of the Year, and he was named Supervisor of the Year, and he received numerous awards, and so on and so on. Also a life-saving award. Dedicated service to the department, much appreciated. Again, I don't see really anything about homicide or that he was a detective or something like that. I don't see that. Maybe I'm missing something. But this is the guy who is basically on the stand today, who is basically criticizing his colleagues in law enforcement, right? And so I think it's like it takes one to know one. Obviously he knows some of the protocols, and so he is saying this is the right thing, and you guys didn't know what you were doing, or you weren't doing your jobs, right? So basically what this day was about was law enforcement criticizing law enforcement, right? Which is something we've just seen in the Kylie Rodney case as well. We're seeing that as well. Okay. SW Firefly, you can post that. You really are welcome to post that. Okay, so let's get started here. So this is from the Austin Statesman. That's Kaitlin, and she obviously isn't, she's present in court, but they may not photograph her, right? Okay. So as I say, Katie Hall, she's the writer for the Austin American Statesman. She's compiled a fantastic summary of the latest developments leading up to the potential trial of Kaitlin Armstrong. I think a lot of what is going on now is possibly to prevent a trial from actually happening. Is it necessary that this goes to trial? Were police protocols violated? And so, all of this is unconstitutional, right? I do think many of the motions filed now and the arguments that are being fielded now are geared to potentially scupper a trial, right? It reminds me quite a lot of the Morphew case, right? Think about what happened with the Morphew case. All these motions, all these arguments, and then ultimately was there a Morphew case, right? Remember, prior to that, law enforcement was attacked as unprofessional, and eventually there was no murder trial, and Barry was eventually tried and slapped on the wrist for voter fraud, right? Now, in terms of the Armstrong case, it is interesting that her defense has even been able to prevent photographs of her being taken inside or out of court. I do have a couple of images that I guess I can share with you guys. Basically over here. because of the control that Kaitlin's defense has been able to exert, you actually get no real sense of the trial in terms of video or photos. You get these sort of, I don't want to call it staged images of the courtroom, but basically these, either it's a photo, or sorry, a drawing of Kaitlin, right, like that. It's either a drawing or it is these sort of empty images of the courtroom. There's another image of I think that's part of the legal team. So that is not Kofa, that's somebody else. And then I think these are two people associated with the defense team. And what I find quite interesting with this image is she's being interrogated, but do you see any handcuffs on her? And that is brought up as she was held against her will and she was handcuffed and all that kind of thing. Well, in these photos, she's not handcuffed. So one's got to be careful also taking the narrative of the defense at face value. It feels like it's also being skewed in a certain way, doesn't it? Okay. I do find it quite incredible that you sort of struggle to actually see pictures of Kaitlin. That is the degree of protection she's getting from her legal counsel. And in the previous live, I think we spoke about Colin saying that he wanted $100,000 back, right? And one from Kaitlin. And one wonders, is some of that money, his money, being used to pay for Caitlin's defense? One just wonders about that. One also wonders, where's the money coming from to pay for a defense? Okay. Someone says the sketch artist is amazing. Yeah, no handcuffs is quite interesting, right? It's also interesting how the sketch artist seems to be seeing her. Is he interpreting her in a certain way? Is he showing her in a sympathetic way? It's quite interesting. What is he trying to convey through that sketch? I can't help looking at her nose, but obviously from the side view, it's harder to tell what we're looking at. Okay, let's continue. So I guess if you're ever accused of murder or find yourself in a situation similar to Caitlin's, I hope that's not going to happen, but you could do worse than having someone like Kofa defending you. Two things that stood out in the competency criticisms, did you guys know this, was that Katie Connor, that's the Austin Police Department detective that was talking to Kaitlin. In fact, I'm not 100% sure if she is a detective. But the officer that spoke to Kaitlin, she's only been working since July 2021. If you think about it, it reminds me a little bit of the one officer in the Moab police stop. One of them was actually just coming out of his training, right? So there was also kind of a sense of someone who is very, very new at the job, right? And is it fair to criticize someone in law enforcement who's been there for a short time? Can you say, you know what, if you've got the badge, you cannot make any mistakes. If you're a dentist or a doctor or a lawyer, you cannot make any mistakes. Just is not allowed to happen, right? That's such a great statement. That is I think only the key people in this community will know what that actually means. That's quite a that's a great point. Okay, so is it a reasonable standard to say that they're incompetent if they made mistakes? So the first thing is Katie Connor has only been with the homicide unit. I think that's actually the point to stress. I don't know if it's that she's only been working since July 2021. She's only been with the homicide unit for less than a year. So that's the first point. The other thing I think is worth raising is this detective, or sorry, this lieutenant that is criticizing these other people. Did he ever work in a homicide unit? I don't know. I'm just asking. Did he ever work in a homicide unit? I know he worked for SWAT, but did he work in a homicide unit? It talks about all the units he did work in: patrol services, criminal investigation services. I don't know if that includes homicides. Training unit, chief's office, but I don't see the word homicide there. So I think that is something worth bringing up. If you're going to criticize someone in the homicide unit, well, were you in the homicide unit? Then this is something I didn't really know. The lead detective, Richard Spittler, this was his first homicide case that he'd ever led. Do you guys know that? It feels a little bit like, what's his name? Detective Steve Thomas with the JonBenet Ramsey case. Well, this is your first murder, so you don't know what you're talking about. Well, did he know what he was talking about? So I personally think inexperience is a factor, but you don't then say what they saw and what they asked and the answers they got is all invalid, right? Patty says, with all due respect, why would law enforcement not choose a very experienced detective? It's a good question. They may actually have put other staff on the case later on. You could also have had them investigating different leads and they had different people asking different questions. You could definitely have had that. Yeah, also Plano is a suburb of Dallas. It's not Austin. Couldn't they find an Austin Police Department officer to talk about another officer, which is, I think, also quite interesting. Yeah, so that's quite an interesting point. Right, so let's go back to this image. Okay, so according to the Statesman, quote, a final defense witness, Douglas Deaton, a former lieutenant at the Plano Police Department, took the stand Monday, that's obviously today, and criticized the way Austin police detectives interviewed Armstrong and put together her arrest affidavit. So can you see it's two aspects? They criticized the interview, what can one call it? Interview tactics, interview style, interview protocols or lack of protocol. That's the one thing, how they spoke. And then the other thing is how they wrote the affidavit, right? So it's how they spoke and how they wrote. That's really the criticism. Terry says, now I can't unsee the potato either. Guys, concentrate. Okay. So if you think about it, in a way, if you ask me for my personal opinion, are these criticisms serious? Are these criticisms valid? And you say, the way that they spoke to her wasn't right, or the way that they wrote about this wasn't right. I kind of think, well, jeepers, you're not really arguing about evidence that was botched or lost or something like that. You're not arguing about the murder weapon that disappeared or someone spilled tomato soup over, right? You are arguing about how someone spoke or how someone wrote. So I'm already kind of thinking, I don't know whether there's much here, but let's have a look, right? So I think the other thing is to say it's what this lieutenant is saying, he didn't really like the way his colleagues spoke and what they wrote, right? And I'm coming into this as a true crime author who studied a lot of affidavits, and I'm also a writer myself, and I can sometimes look at the narrative, the written narrative, whether it's the affidavit, whether it's the in the discovery, and say, well, that is a decent narrative. It's factual, it's well executed. Or you might say that's pretty fluffy and it doesn't really go anywhere, right? So he's saying the narrative is weak, right? I don't know if I agree, but let's kind of have a look at it. It is interesting that in law enforcement, part of what how can I put it? Part of the job of law enforcement is to develop a narrative, to tell a story with all the cogent facts and information. Then lawyers take that narrative and they either what's the word? I don't want to say embellish because that's the wrong word. They either build on it, they build their case on it, or as in the case of the defense, they try and pull that narrative to pieces, right? So you do want facts, timestamps, um, reinforced statements. You don't want to make you don't want any speculation in there. And I think that's quite a good way to seg into the Kylie Rodney case and say, if you want to take a case to trial and you don't want to lose that case, you make sure there's zero speculation in your affidavit. In other words, the substance of the Kylie Rodney case, which is 90% speculation, wouldn't make it past the affidavit stage. But of course, that's the bread and butter of YouTube. It just would not see the light of day in a courtroom. And that's the difference in standards between YouTube investigators and law enforcement and lawyers. There's justice in the real world and there's the pursuit of justice on YouTube. The standards are just completely different. I hope that's quite a useful way of thinking about it. You cannot have any speculation in your affidavit. And the one area that COFA, I think one or two areas that COFA found that felt speculative was he said, how on earth can you say that Kaitlin was jealous? How can you rationalize, how can you state as a fact that Kaitlin was jealous? And with her boyfriend, with Colin not really supporting that, you kind of have a problem. How can you prove that she was jealous? Do you see the problem? Do you see how something that seems quite clear and quite certain can also be twisted or can be criticized to say that's speculation? How can you prove that she is a jealous person? And the question is, does the affidavit deal with that aspect properly? And Deaton is saying no, right? Okay, so let's continue. So I believe he says this in order to sort of cover himself that I'm not taking pot shots. I'm not attacking my colleagues. I'm not being a jerk. I'm actually concerned about law enforcement, right? In other words, what he's doing, the way I see it, is he is criticizing his colleagues, but he's saying, no, I'm not criticizing colleagues. I think the leadership of the department maybe weren't conscientious. And I think there's some merit to that because, as someone said, maybe you could have had a more experienced officer on a case like this. But the other side is, at some point, you've got to start your first homicide. At some point, you've got to do your first homicide, right? Anyway, so he says, I believe that the leadership of the Austin Police Department failed these police detectives. What do you think of that statement? I believe that the leadership of the Austin Police Department failed these police detectives. The detectives who played essential roles in the investigation seemed to be inexperienced and to have little support or guidance from their superiors. That is according to Deaton's testimony. They played essential roles, but they were inexperienced. Also, they had little support or guidance. I think what's quite important to bear in mind with this is what was the date that this happened, and we know it was May 11. We know that this crime occurred on May 11, right? Okay. Does anyone know what else was happening in Texas around about that time? Does anyone know what else was taking place around about that time? Well, it was this. That happened just less than 2 weeks later, on May 24th. Now, I wonder whether that came up in the courtroom. I don't know if it did. I wasn't there. But if you want to say one particular reason why there might be a lack of resources, is there may be something going on in the whole state of Texas that is using up resources, right? Now, I could be wrong. I could be wrong that that incident had nothing to do with this, but there were also other events taking place in Austin that are also, would also possibly be relevant. This is the distance between those centers. It's about 160 miles, and I think you can kind of ask, where would you get resources first? Would you get it from Austin, or would you get it from San Antonio or Houston, or did they get resources from anywhere else? Yes or no? I don't know the answer to that. I just do know that you can imagine that there was quite a lot of resources directed to this and a lot of attention directed to this, right? Okay. Okay, so I think if you're going to criticize anyone for not Mirandizing, so that was one of the big issues, was that Kaitlin wasn't Mirandized, right? I think if you're going to criticize anyone for not doing that, think about the Chris Watts case. Officer Coonrod not only didn't Mirandize Watts when he arrived, he allowed a mother and her son and an infant. There was even a little toddler running around a crime scene. You actually had 3 people running around a crime scene, basically contaminating it. Was that officer ever the target of incompetency, or was Chris Watts the focus of what happened? Right? Do you see where I'm coming from? So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at the Chris Watts affidavit and say, okay, well, let's look at that narrative. Was that narrative written very well, right? And is that narrative 100% accurate, right? And if it's not, should we release Chris Watts from Dodge Correctional like immediately? Oh, there's a spelling mistake in the affidavit, or there's an error over there. Okay, wow, all of this, you violated protocol. Guys, let's get Chris Watts out of jail, right? So let's have a look at this. This is from the original Watts affidavit. And can you see at the top here, it says, Nicole attempted to enter the front door, but a latch prevented it from opening. Then on the next page, I called, Officer Coonrod, I think, is it? Nicole called Christopher Watts, requested him to come home. Upon arrival, Officer Coonrod checked all windows and doors. He discovered they were locked. Officer Coonrod contacted Chris and asked for the code. He said it didn't work. When Christopher arrived, Coonrod entered the room. I'm looking for something there. And what I'm looking for is in this affidavit where it says Nicole Atkinson entered the residence. And in fact, she entered, I think, before the officer did. I'm looking for where Nicole's son, where it says Nicole's son entered the residence. I don't see that. I'm looking for where another little child entered the residence. I don't see that as well. So couldn't you say, if you were Chris Watts' defense attorney, that, I don't know, the officer was incompetent or the officer was inexperienced or that the affidavit's untrue, right? What do you think? What is mentioned here is when Christopher arrived, Officer Coonrod entered the home with Chris's consent in an attempt to locate Shanann, but discovered they were not home. But there's no mention about what Nicole Atkinson did, right? So if you were a defense lawyer, if Chris Watts had hired a defense lawyer, not a public defender, although you never know if they would have brought this up, but if he did defend himself, they could have attacked this part of the affidavit, right? And I think there's some merit to that. I think there is some merit to that. But does that change ultimately what happened? If Nicole Atkinson went into the house, does that change the circumstances? Does Nicole Atkinson become a suspect? I think that could be a defense strategy. Another one is, what's the other aspect? The fact that her son found his phone under the couch. Could you say everything on her phone is now inadmissible because her son may have tampered with the phone and maybe even her son is a suspect? Can you see how if you want to make a defense case, you can look at an affidavit and try and find errors in it. You can try and not look at what's there, but what's not there, right? Can you see how you can do that with the Chris Watts case? Yeah, didn't you know Nicole has a son? His name's Nicholas. That's Nicole Atkinson. Okay, so that's the first point to mention. But basically, Officer Coonrod didn't Mirandize Chris Watts either. And so again, just in a basic way, was the officer ever the target of incompetency? Or was Chris Watts the focus of what happened? Now, if you're not happy with that, if you say, you know what, officers do need to do the right thing. If you're not happy with that, then the same thing applies to FBI agent Graham Coder. Do you remember that he didn't Mirandize Chris Watts either? As far as I remember, when he arrived on the, was it Tuesday night? Yeah. So remember, he interviewed him Tuesday night and Wednesday morning, but on Tuesday night, he never Mirandized Chris Watts. In fact, I don't think Coder ever Mirandized Chris Watts. I think Tammy Lee did the next day. That was when he was Mirandized, right? So can you really say, because an FBI agent didn't Mirandize Chris Watts one day after his wife had disappeared, that he's incompetent, he's inexperienced, and you must tear up the affidavit and it's case dismissed? Do you think you can make that argument? That's an FBI agent. Yeah, so you've got to be very careful with, that's why I say semantics and the details matter. You've got to be very careful the words you use, and you've got to try and not say too much. You must say the minimum, but also not too much and also not too little. You've also got to make your case. Julie says, good analogy, because at first a safe and well-checked, then a missing person. Yeah. So, I mean, you must see what they faced with in that situation was a missing persons case. I suppose you could argue this was a homicide investigation. Talking to someone in relation to a homicide investigation, yeah, you probably should start Mirandizing, right? The other side is, should you Mirandize every single person then? Every person you talk to, should you Mirandize them? I suppose you could say to be safe, yes, but this is the flip side to that. I think it's tricky. It's a tricky area to say not doing that, not Mirandizing everyone equals incompetence. That's my first argument. But imagine if you apply that across the board, that everyone you talk to, you need to Mirandize. So in other words, before you talk to anyone, so let's say it's Chris Watts' neighbor in that case, let's say it's Nicole Atkinson and her son and Chris Watts' colleagues, every single one of them you Mirandize first, and you say, yes, no, it's the right thing to do, Mirandize. And so the first thing you say to them is, you know what, anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Would you be willing to talk to me? Yes, great. Okay, so I just want you to know anything you can and say could be used against you in a court of law, right? And I think they should kind of Mirandize people who come forward onto YouTube, like Sammy Smith, and say, but do a YouTube Mirandizing and say, Sammy, are you aware that before you say anything on YouTube, everything you can and say will be used against you on YouTube? Do you still want to make your statement? And how long do you want to make that statement? Do you want to speak for an hour, or do you want to speak for 5 minutes, or would you rather just say one sentence, right? In other words, that whole Mirandizing thing, I think, also should be applied on YouTube. If you do apply it, do you think people are going to speak easy? Do you think people are going to volunteer information as comfortably? That's the same thing law enforcement are faced with. And the answer is, yes, you should Mirandize, but also there is this aspect where innocent people, they are innocent, but they may not want to come forward because something they say could be used against them, and they are actually innocent, which you've just seen with Sammy Smith, right? Anyway, Deaton goes on to say, this is quoting from this Austin American article. Where is it? There it is. Deaton said, Austin police detectives demonstrated a reckless disregard for the truth when they wrote Armstrong's affidavit. I think I've seen those words before. I think I've seen them in Cofer's statement. It was a reckless disregard for the truth. For this reason, Armstrong's attorneys are arguing that the judge should suppress all evidence obtained as a result of the arrest warrant that accused her of murder. They should suppress all evidence obtained as a result of the arrest warrant. So what do you think is going to happen, or what do you think could happen if that does happen? If the judge decides, wow, you violated her rights, the affidavit was, let's say, unconstitutional, all the evidence we got as a result of this gone. Do you think that's going to possibly lead to there being no murder trial, there being no trial whatsoever? Look at what happened in the Barry Morphew case. This was improper, that was improper, that was improper, that expert gone, that expert gone. You can't introduce that evidence. Gone, gone, gone. Ultimately, no case closed. That's the result of the homicide investigation. That's the result of the prosecution. Gone. In other words, you said something that was recklessly said, right? And again, Think about what is being said here by a defense lawyer. You had reckless disregard for what you were saying. You had reckless disregard for what you were writing. So now we're going to throw away this entire case because of that. Because what you were saying wasn't based on evidence, or wasn't based on the right protocols, or wasn't based on the right procedure. And so as a result, the entire case is going to be thrown out. Or it should be thrown out, right? Do you think it should be thrown out? Do you think if they spoke to Kaitlin for 10 minutes, this is really what it comes down to. Do you think if an inexperienced officer spoke to Kaitlin for 10 minutes, that the case against her should be dropped, or that the case, that the affidavit should be null and void? That's exactly right. The O.J. Simpson case was also based on questioning, on the questioning process, on this idea of a rush to judgment, right? Yeah, it is about technicalities. I just want you to bear in mind that what is being argued here, think about it in relation to the Kylie Rodney thing as well, about standards of proof, right? So I don't know much, or let me put it this way. I don't know if the Barry Morphew affidavit should be held up as the poster child of affidavits. And we did cover the affidavit in a lot of detail on this channel. It's good to do that. It's good to go through those affidavits exhaustively, because you then become well versed in affidavits. So you cover that affidavit, you cover the Watts affidavit, you cover the Kaitlin Armstrong affidavit. I wrote a book based on the Letitia Stalk affidavit. That was an affidavit that was actually leaked. I wrote a whole book based on that affidavit, right? That was, I think, a 32-page affidavit, but I wrote a book about that. When you do these repeated deep dives into affidavits, you learn about affidavits. You learn how they are written, you learn about the language, you learn how certain idiosyncrasies appear in certain affidavits and others in others. Sometimes there'll be telemetry, the focus of one affidavit. Another one will be photographs. Others will be maps. Other ones will be cell phone pings. Others may be GPS coordinates, for example, in the Chris Watts case. Others may be text messages. Others may be almost all of these things. And the Morphew affidavit was a lot of things. It was cell phone pings. And I keep hearing that cell phone pings are so inaccurate. Well, have you read the Morphew affidavit? Have you seen the Morphew affidavit? Cell phone pings, text messages, CCTV footage, maps. The Morphew affidavit had all of those things, right? And yet the Morphew affidavit didn't. You can almost argue that that is not the poster child for successful prosecutions, right? So you can't hold up the Morphew affidavit as the poster child for affidavits, but I still think we've had a chance to look at a few, as I mentioned, the Letitia Stalk case, the Chris Watts case. I personally thought the Morphew affidavit was pretty well executed. But the problem in that particular case was no body. And that's why I think they went to the ends of the earth. I think that affidavit is 131 pages long. I think that affidavit is so detailed, so comprehensive, because you have all of that in order to make up for, well, you actually don't have a body at the end of the day. And we've just seen with the Kristen Smart case that you can have a no body equals crime case. And I'd love to actually see that affidavit. If any of you can get hold of it, let me know. I would love to examine that affidavit. But that's what I think is happening, is we don't have a body, so we need an affidavit that embodies all the details of that case, right? And ultimately, that kind of went nowhere. In the Kaitlin Armstrong case, there is a body. You've got a very up-to-date crime scene. In the Barry Morphew case, it took a year to release that affidavit, took a year to compile that affidavit, took a year to write that affidavit. When I say year, I mean day after day, week after week, month after month, interview after interview. I think they ultimately interviewed him 13 times. I definitely don't think you can say there was too little in that affidavit in terms of content. You couldn't accuse them of there being too little. You could say, well, what about the evidence aspect? But you couldn't say there wasn't enough detail, right? But that's a case that the affidavit came about a year later. This is an affidavit that came about days later, right? And you didn't have a situation where there wasn't a body. You did have a body. You knew where it was. You knew when it took place. You knew it had 3 bullet wounds, and you could say with a reasonable degree of certainty what kind of weapon was used, right? And then you had other relatively circumstantial evidence, right? So can you conflate the Morphew case, where there's not even a body, with the Mo Wilson case? Can you say they're very similar? That the Morphew case didn't go to trial and there was a bicycle taken from the scene. Well, the Kaitlin Armstrong case, same thing. Bicycle was taken from the scene. It shouldn't really be taken to trial. The affidavit was quite clumsy. Is it the same thing? Are they interchangeable? Now, it may be possible that certain evidence will be suppressed. It's possible that the case may go to trial, but they will suppress certain evidence, such as, I'm talking about during the jury phase, if it gets that far, where they may say, there's a point where Kaitlin was asked, or the point was made, do you know that we've got CCTV showing your vehicle at the scene or near the scene or in the neighborhood, where she apparently nodded her head and she didn't say anything? They may say that's going to be suppressed. That may not be allowed at trial. That's definitely a possibility. What does Rick say? I feel terrible for their family. Yeah, good to have you here, Rick. Okay. So you can argue that suggesting jealousy as a motive is premature in the affidavit, or you could say that is speculation, but it's anchored in the fabric of the narrative nevertheless. That's my counter argument. You could say, I'm sorry, it's baseless to talk about jealousy as a motive, and I do think that if you're going to give writing courses for detectives, if you're going to give courses in how to write an affidavit to investigators, I think one of the things you need to have as a bullet point is be very careful and preferably avoid addressing motive in your affidavit. And the reason for that is you can prosecute a case. I don't know if you guys know this. You can prosecute a case without ever bringing up the word motive. As a prosecutor, motive isn't essential to prosecuting a homicide. You've got to show things like intention and whether the evidence supports that, right? Whether there was intent. You don't need to show motive. I think that's something that has changed over the course of criminal law. Once upon a time, you did have to say what the motive was. Now you don't. You don't have to. It's not essential that you provide that sort of aspect. And I must say that's the key area that I discuss when I write my books, is I go into the area that is so difficult, motive. But in terms of law enforcement, be very careful. If you're writing an affidavit, be very careful and preferably avoid expressing motive in your affidavit. And the same applies to prosecutors. Be very careful and preferably avoid expressing your speculations on motive in the courtroom. And that's why you don't see that in the Oscar Pistorius case. You never hear the prosecutor that's in that case saying why the crime happened. And I thought that was a weakness. I understood that it was difficult, but I thought it was a weakness. And the judge actually said that. The judge says, you've never actually said why. You had exactly the same thing in the Henry van Breda case, although he was convicted on the first sort of shot. But even in that case, we killed his parents and brother. The prosecution didn't even try to address this issue of motive. And the judge brought that up as well and said, we found you guilty. We can't believe that you, not we can't believe that you did it, but it's still incomprehensible that you did it. We don't know what the motive was. And the media, the South African media kept saying, we still don't know what the motive was. My books are all about motive, right? So be very careful if you're in law enforcement or a lawyer or a prosecutor talking about motive, because it's easy to say that that's speculation. You can start talking about it where you've got the own words of the person who's texted something. And that is kind of what is being addressed in the Kaitlin Armstrong case, where someone is alleging that she herself said, I'm going to kill her, or I really want to kill her, or whatever. Then I think those are kind of exceptional circumstances where someone says that sort of thing. That's where I think you can make an exception. Again, you still got to be very careful. Now, I don't know for a fact, maybe some of you watching may know this. If those anonymous callers who heard Kaitlin saying those words, let's say allegedly heard, have they come forward and identified themselves? Because if they haven't, then you have the problem of you've got an anonymous caller that can you bring them into trial and can you have them testify, or can't you? Or are they choosing to stay anonymous, choosing not to come forward? Well, then you may have a real problem in terms of your case. They call me, Joe says, where can I find your books to purchase? Are you talking on the Henry van Breda case? This is my Amazon author page. So if you just scroll through this, you should find it. So just go and have a look at that link. They call me Joe. But thanks for the question. Okay. Run the World says, what case is he talking about right now? Well, right now I'm talking about the Kaitlin Armstrong case. Katie says, aren't there texts too proving she contacted Mo and him saying he didn't know her? That's a good point. We don't know at this point what is on Mo's phone. We do know that law enforcement have Mo's phone. We also know that law enforcement took Colin's phone and Kaitlin's phone. And then there's also possible social media that could show something, but we don't know that for a fact. Sharon says, I've been following the Waxrusa Christmas parade. Okay. Double Rainbow says, I want to read your book on that affidavit. Okay, so that is this book. Okay, that is the Letitia Stork case. The name of the book is Boy Interrupted. Just trying to find it here. Here it is. So it's available in paperback, and it's also available on Kindle and Kindle Unlimited. So yeah. Is that what you were looking for? Julie says, not heard anything about forensic evidence yet. Yeah. Could there be footprints, shoe prints? Zircon says, will Letitia ever go to court? Well, let's stay on this case, but that's supposed to be happening early next year. Okay, so let me keep going. So you can argue that suggesting jealousy as a motive is premature in this case, or speculation, but it's anchored, as I say, in the fabric of the narrative, not only from one caller. You might say, you know what, I think it's a bit opportunistic that, one person called in and said, I thought Kaitlin was jealous, but there were actually two people that called in. That changes things somewhat. That strengthens that evidence, I would say, quite significantly. You've got, and not only that, you've got two callers that had direct contact with all three protagonists. In other words, two callers saying they knew Mo, Colin, and Kaitlin, right? Which is addressing this whole idea of, let me just go back to, which is addressing this whole idea of a love triangle. And, I think what they're trying to do, what the defense is trying to do, is show there's no love triangle. There aren't three people in the story. But aren't there? Isn't this the story about Mo Wilson who was shot? Isn't this the story about Colin Strickland, who saw her on the day that she was shot? And isn't this, to some extent, I mean, I'm asking the question, isn't this also, to some extent, the story of Colin Strickland's girlfriend at the time, who shortly after this went to Costa Rica? What is that all about? Weren't they in quite an important relationship? Then did she just leave? Why did she just leave? So even if Kaitlin has got nothing to do with this case, you still wonder what was going on there. Why did you sell your car? Why did you leave Austin? Why, when everyone was looking for you, didn't you say, hi, here I am. I'm actually afraid of Colin, or I'm afraid of this person, or I didn't do it, right? Why do you have that situation? Is it really so crazy to think about three people in this scenario? Should you think of 4 people or 5 people or 6 people? How many people should you think about? Or should you think about just one person? What's the proper way to think about this if that's the wrong way to think about it? Should you be thinking about an intruder? Well, who? Where's his DNA or fingerprints, or where's the witness that talks about that? If that's the proper way to think about it. What is the sort of natural way to think about this if this is not the right way? It also says State District Judge Brenda Kennedy. So it's quite interesting that you've got a female judge. She said she will rule on this matter by November 9th. So in about 2 weeks' time, she'll be ruling on all of this. And I think the counter argument to the Ali made a mistake here, hence dismissed the case, is that I think a fair-minded judge may say, and tell me if I'm wrong when I say this, right? So if you're like really strict and you say, well, you made a mistake here, case dismissed, throw it out. I think a fair-minded judge may say the following. Tell me if you agree. You know what? You can't expect a flawless investigation. In the John Benet Ramsey case, you had problems like, and if this is a problem, I'm not sure you can call this a problem, but you had the problem that you didn't have murders in Boulder. So you kind of say, let's acknowledge that this is the situation, that we don't have very experienced homicide detectives because we don't have that sort of crime here. That's the John Benet Ramsey case. But in all the cases we've dealt with, Madeleine McCann, Amanda Knox, Chris Watts, with Officer Coonrod, you could argue that there are some mistakes that are made somewhere along the line. So holding police to this absolutely high standard, and you also have that in the Kylie Rodney case, law enforcement may not make a mistake, but then when another entity comes along and they find Kylie and they're the heroes, can they make mistakes? Or do you also say, no, that's not a mistake? Or can you say, you know what, we are human beings, all of us are human beings, and we sometimes do something wrong and we do make mistakes. In this case, maybe they were inexperienced. Maybe they are allowed to make mistakes. Maybe in law enforcement, mistakes are made. But isn't the bigger picture here that the mistake that was made was that somebody was murdered? Do you compare the mistake of I didn't cross a T in an affidavit to someone's murdered? That's also a mistake. No. The point of justice and law enforcement is to prosecute criminals, not to criminalize law enforcement. So maybe a judge can say, you know what, under a given set of circumstances, let's say with not perfectly experienced personnel, and the other side is you've got slippery suspects. Maybe this is a more slippery case than the usual case. What is reasonable? What is reasonable in that? What do we actually have? Not what don't we have? What do we have? And what are the facts regardless of who got them? Right? So instead of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, instead of throwing the case away because of who investigated it, maybe you can say, what do we have regardless of who got them? So in other words, let's take this to the Kylie Rodney case. What do we have? Kylie Rodney's vehicle was found. What do we have now? You don't say, no, let's focus on who found it. No, let's focus on who didn't find it. You say, what do we have? Well, we have the vehicle. What do we have inside the vehicle? Let's focus on that. Let that dictate the narrative. Let the evidence dictate the narrative. What a thought. What a freaking thought. Let's have the actual information dictate the narrative and tell us what's going on here. Oh, no. Let's rather have somebody else tell us. Let's rather have someone else dictate the narrative. No, let's have the evidence dictate the narrative, right? What are the facts regardless of who got them? That should be the focus always of law enforcement, of prosecutors, of juries, of judges. What are the facts regardless of who? Okay. So he goes on to say, when it came to a police detective's interview with Armstrong, Deaton said the detective should have ended the conversation the moment Armstrong asked if she should have a lawyer present. He should have ended it that moment. That's what he says. Where is that image of Kaitlin? I think it's over here somewhere. Do you know what the flip side is to that argument? If you say law enforcement should have ended that moment, you could also say Kaitlin should have. When Kaitlin was told, we can't hold you, we're not arresting you, Kaitlin could also have gotten up. So in other words, what about her agency? Do you say Kaitlin is like this invisible person that only does what she's told what to do? Or is she, and you could say the same with Chris Watts. If Chris Watts isn't Miranda's and he's also told you could leave, but he doesn't leave, should you then say, all agency then goes on to law enforcement, and then a defense lawyer comes on later and says the total responsibility to do the right thing was on law enforcement. They should have known Chris Watts was going to confess. And so because of that, law enforcement are guilty here, and Chris Watts should be released. They got a confession by tricking him. Because that's exactly the argument you can make in that case. Or can you say, Chris Watts is an adult who is about the same age as Kaitlin, and he made an adult decision, not a very good one, in his case, not to get a lawyer, right? And to continue talking and even to do a polygraph. And he must take responsibility for that adult decision that he took. What a thought. What a thought that is. That an adult who commits a crime should be held responsible for the adult decision that they took. That's in the Chris Watts case. In this case, do you not say, as an adult, when she's told that she can go, and as you can see in this particular photo, she doesn't have handcuffs on. So why is she not leaving? Is that the fault of law enforcement that she didn't leave? Le Petit says motive is used to guide investigators and motive is presented to the jury for its deliberation. Motive isn't always provided. It doesn't have to be provided. I think if you're a good lawyer, you know what the motive is, and you can make a very strong argument, even without a certain amount of evidence. And that resonates, and then that's a very big part of your case. Melster says, didn't Chris confess to his dad? He did, but he also confessed to where, and then he also made a subsequent confession as well. Okay, so Deaton goes on to say the following. That's this guy. This guy. When it came to a police detective's interview with Armstrong, that's Katie Connor, Deaton said the detective should have ended the conversation the moment Armstrong asked if she should have a lawyer present. So you can say exactly the same thing with Chris Watts. He also said, and his father also said, do you guys remember in the Chris Watts case, his father said something like, you should get a lawyer. And he said, I think earlier, I think he was talking with Kofa. Not Kofa, Coda. It's funny how similar the names are. I think he mentioned getting a lawyer as well. But do you remember in the Chris Watts case, his father said, we should get you a really good lawyer. And the agents basically ran into the room moments after that. Were they criticized for violating his rights? If he'd said, no, stop right now, we are going to get a lawyer, then that would have been the case. But he elected not to do that. So they're taking all the agency from a 34-year-old, and they're saying, no, she had no independent thought process. She had no will of her own, and I always find it quite interesting. It's like this thing of when someone commits a crime, they have the ability to take matters into their own hands. They're taking a kind of responsibility, that they're saying, this is the situation, I'm going to act in this way. I'm going to act deliberately. I'm going to act intentionally, right? And then when the situation is quite different and that person's being asked about potentially their actions or potentially of what they did, then suddenly they've got no ability to act with any intention or deliberation. Should you get a lawyer? Well, if you can commit a crime, can you not think to get a lawyer? And if you decide not to get a lawyer, can't you be held accountable for that decision? It's like this crazy thing where you can be held accountable for committing a crime. Sorry, you can be held accountable, or you should be held accountable for committing a crime. But when I'm not saying this really very well, you sorry, I'm just kind of muddling myself just with trying to figure out these defense arguments. In the process of trying to prosecute a murder, you say, well, we're not going to hold you accountable for committing that crime of murder. We're going to hold law enforcement accountable for not allowing you to not get a lawyer or something like that. That's going to be the focus of the accountability. I don't know. Anyway, Jennifer Strickland says, Kaitlin followed Colin, and it makes sense that law enforcement and anybody would assume there's distrust, but will there be enough circumstantial evidence if there isn't forensic? Could Kaitlin have been set up? Could Kaitlin have been set up? By who? Set up by who? I think I know what the answer is. Set up by law enforcement. So law enforcement committed the crime, or law enforcement can't solve the crime. So who did commit the crime? You can keep opening up rabbit holes and opening up doors, but then go through them, and don't just open up a rabbit hole and say there's a rabbit hole. Go into it, like in the Stephen Avery case, where you say law enforcement didn't want to pay $30 million or whatever it was for wrongful imprisonment. So did they then kill Teresa Halbach? Did they commit a murder just to pin that on Stephen Avery so that they didn't have to pay a certain amount? They're not paying it. It's taxpayers' money. It's not a particular law enforcement officer that's going to lose his income because they're paying that amount. And how did they know that Teresa would go there and actually meet with, all that kind of thing? It's kind of quite crazy. Anyway, Jennifer also says Kaitlin followed Colin. So Kaitlin followed Colin, I guess you're saying, to the crime scene or to Cash's house. And then it makes sense that law enforcement would assume there's distrust between Kaitlin and Colin, maybe. But will there be enough circumstantial evidence if there isn't forensics? To me, this is a similar case to the Henry van Breda axe murders. I don't think it's so complicated. I don't think I think this idea that there's a lack of circumstantial evidence is quite strange. Like, there's a lack of circumstantial evidence. Okay, so you've got the body, you've got 3 bullets, not 1, 3. There's a way of tracking which bullet belongs to which gun, and you can argue that, but it's nevertheless something like that. I mean, I don't think in the Alec Baldwin case they're saying we can't prove that that gun shot this bullet. I don't think that's an issue. Will there be enough circumstantial evidence? The other side is there's CCTV, and I suppose you can say, well, there's no number plate. But besides the circumstantial evidence, is there forensics? I think there's quite a lot of forensics, such as time of death. There may be all sorts of things we don't know at this point. Text messages, GPS, the whole fabric of the social media and the text messages. There may be a lot of other witnesses that could talk about knowing these people a lot better and their psychology and their relationships in terms of other relationships. But yeah, could Kaitlin have been set up? That's quite an interesting question from someone with the surname of Strickland, I must say. Could Kaitlin have been set up? That, I think, is also the defense of Chad Daybell by his kids, was that he was set up. It's kind of like a question that just does it take you anywhere? So if you say, could Kaitlin had been set up, what's your answer to that compared to the other narrative? Angela says, what about the phone pings? I think you've got to ask the question, did someone have a phone in their vehicle when they went from A to B? We do know that Colin had his phone with her when he went to her. We know that. We don't know absolutely where Caitlin's phone was when that night. We don't know that at this point. We don't know that for a fact. It looks like a Jeep. It looks like it's got a bicycle rack on it. We all know that sort of thing. Jennifer's saying, thanks for that, saying, I'm not related. I did ask you that earlier, so I was just a bit curious why you wouldn't answer that when I did ask you. But could Kaitlin have been set up by Colin? If you've been paying attention to the transcripts we've been dealing with, Colin seems to be trying not to implicate Kaitlin. He is, in a way, defending her, saying she's not jealous. He was asked point blank, do you think he killed Mo? And he said, it's unfathomable, it's impossible, I can't think that. So if he was trying to implicate her, why would he not do that in some subtle or unsubtle way when he was asked about it? So if you're saying Colin wanted to extricate himself out of his relationship, so he's trying to implicate Kaitlin, and maybe it's an easy way to get his money back or something like that. Well, why did he not take the opportunity to do that? So anyway, short answer, no. Short answer, no. I don't think he's trying to set her up. So look at some of your questions. Julie says the things like the bike rack, the chrome trim on the car help. Yeah. Also, are there telematics for that vehicle that could be useful? Melissa says it's the preponderance of evidence. Yeah, it's not one thing. It's a whole mosaic, and the question is, where does that mosaic take you? Yeah, we are presuming everyone to be innocent until proven guilty. Okay. Someone asked, was Kaitlin wearing gloves? It's quite an interesting thought. Okay, so let's continue. I don't want to go too much past the 90-minute mark. So he says, the other thing he says is, this is Deaton. He says, I've not encountered any instructors or trainers who would have said it was appropriate to continue that conversation without the lawyer present. I've not encountered any instructors or trainers who would have said it was appropriate to continue. Well, I've encountered an FBI agent and a CBI agent who did that. Of course, you could say at that point Watts had been Mirandized, but the point is they'd expressed, father and son, Chris Watts and his father had expressed that they intended to get a lawyer, or the intention to get a lawyer had been expressed, and both agents continued to question him and got a confession out of him in terms of where the bodies were after that point. So if you say, I've not encountered anyone who would do that, I have. Does that make sense? It's not as strange as I think he's making it out to be. I mean, we have got a precedent for this in true crime. I'm sure there are others. Anyway, then can I just say that the police defense expert isn't a practicing cop. It's not a guy who's actually in law enforcement. He's a former lieutenant at the Plano Police Department, right? So what he's doing now is earning a living. Maybe you could say he's earning something part-time or full-time. In this particular case, criticizing other people in law enforcement. I don't know if it's unfair to say, maybe it is, maybe it's unfair to say, was he paid as a defense expert, as ex-law enforcement, to offer testimony against two people in law enforcement that have just started out their careers, and his criticism that he's being paid for, he's going to make money. He's going to be, I assume, maybe he's doing it pro bono, but I'm assuming that his testimony may lead to the careers of the officers he's criticizing. Maybe it's going to set them back. Maybe they're going to lose income. Maybe their careers are going to get off to a slower start than otherwise. But in another way, you could say he's being paid to offer his expertise, and his expertise may lead to them being paid less. Maybe what needs to happen is they need to go back to training. And so when they're not training, will they earn the same amount of money? I don't know. On the other hand, just in the business of A, getting Kaitlin's birth date wrong, and B, allowing the suspect to flee the country, you can see that inexperience and silly mistakes were a factor. You guys agree with that? You know, I don't think you should just defend law enforcement and say, you know what, they're the good guys, no matter what. The other side is they did get Kaitlin's birth date wrong somewhere, and there's quite an interesting intrigue there. We'll get to that in a moment. But the other thing is they did allow their suspect to flee the country, right? Law enforcement did actually, they weren't like, if they thought Kaitlin was guilty, right? If law enforcement thought this is our prime suspect, they did actually allow her to get out. She flew out of Austin. She sold her vehicle. Were they monitoring her? Was there some kind of surveillance, or was there just a vehicle parked outside of their home? Were they actually kind of following her and seeing what she was doing? Or did it catch them by surprise that she actually flew right out of Austin, right? So I think you can argue that they were inexperienced, and that mistakes were made. Silly mistakes were made in this case. Way back when we were following the whole case, and it was like, wow, it looks like the date on the affidavit was wrong, and it looks like now that it might not have been. But anyway, also, how on earth did they allow her just to fly to New York? Well, because mistakes were made. But you could say the same with Vicky White and Casey White. Were mistakes made there? Yes, mistakes were made there. A lot of these cases take place, a lot of criminal law and criminal cases are because someone did make a mistake. Someone committed a crime, and maybe that was complicated by another mistake, right? Okay. So I'm not sure you can argue that didn't help Kaitlin. So if you're saying law enforcement law enforcement are the bad guys here. They damage Kaitlin's rights to a fair trial. Law enforcement are in trouble because they hurt Kaitlin's constitutional rights. Well, actually, it allowed her to go free. So I don't really know how you can argue that the inexperienced officers, because they botched something, it actually allowed Kaitlin to not be, in custody, right? That's the other side of the argument, is that because they were inexperienced, they weren't able to catch her. They were trying to catch her and they couldn't. So how does that actually impinge her rights? Do you see what I'm getting at? If you want to argue, I suppose you can argue that improper Ali actions helped catch Kaitlin, not that they prevented Ali from catching Kaitlin for a lot longer than they wanted to, or they otherwise would have. So I guess you can come to the same point by two opposing arguments, that Ali was wrong, either because they were too good at their jobs or they were too bad. Or I guess you could argue both of those at the same time. Either way, they moved too quickly and spoke to Kaitlin too soon, or they released her and then they struggled to catch her. And this slowness is worthy of prosecution, worthy of criticism. That, I think, is kind of the counter argument, is if you say the slowness in catching Kaitlin, in other words, my client was captured by law enforcement eventually. Is that being criticized? But you're trying to defend your client. But it took a long time to catch her. Not a very short time, a very long time to catch her. Terry says the error was in her favor, if anything. Okay. The other thing that was a surprise to me is in this article by the Austin American Statesman, it says the birth date on the warrant and Armstrong's birthday were actually the same. Connor couldn't verify that. Or what does it say? Connor could have verified that. That's the female law enforcement officer, Katie Connor. She could have verified that with Armstrong while she was in the room with her, but didn't. So if you think about this, the entire fugitive thing could have been forestalled, could have been prevented, if one of those law enforcement officers just said, hey, Kaitlin, what's your actual date of birth? And well, also assuming that Kaitlin gave the accurate date of birth, right? So that's something I definitely learned, that if she was just asked, and I don't know whether she would have, that's quite an interesting question. Would she have told the truth or wouldn't she have? That's definitely an interesting aspect. Okay. Deaton also criticized the fact that the police referenced an anonymous caller's tip in Armstrong's arrest affidavit without being able to corroborate it. The caller alleged that Armstrong told her at a party that she wanted to kill Wilson. Now, what that suggests is that there must be, or there should be, or that you can expect that there are multiple witnesses to that, not just two. The other thing that you could say is, if you can find or identify one witness, or you can identify that party, you can say with a reasonable degree of certainty who was at that party. Yeah, ask for your ID. Yeah, that is not rocket science, you're right. During the party, the anonymous caller told Armstrong that people sometimes say things like that when someone is unfaithful in a relationship. But Armstrong responded, no, I really wanted to kill her. So that's something that came up today. This is an interesting issue, especially if the anonymous caller has still not been willing to identify themselves. And if this anonymous caller is a pro cyclist, and you would imagine they would be, there's actually more than one, you can actually imagine that that's a problem in terms of this. The same potential issue that Colin Strickland is a professional athlete and he's trying to protect his interests, you could have with other witnesses that also want to do the same thing, and thus they may not be willing to identify themselves. So if this is in the media, this whole thing of there are anonymous callers and we're talking about them, and they're watching this, maybe you're watching it right now, and the anonymous caller is sitting out there watching, that would certainly be interesting. Then it looks like law enforcement are actually being hung out to dry. If the callers are legit, even if they aren't, perhaps they should start preparing themselves for Kaitlin to be back on the streets because they didn't come forward. So if you're one of those callers and you're deciding, I'm not going to come forward, you should start preparing yourself for the possibility of Kaitlin being released and being back on the streets. And if what you said is, if you did say this and you do exist, wouldn't Kaitlin know who you are as well? Deaton also said that it was bad detective work to include a couple of nods that Armstrong gave in the interview in her arrest affidavit. That's from this article from the Austin American Statesman. So I don't know if you see what's going on here. This is an analogy to the 300 witnesses, party goers in the Kylie Rodney case that don't want to come forward. Can you see it's kind of analogous to that? The anonymous callers that don't really want to identify themselves because they could lose something. They only complicate the issue. Do you guys agree with that, that it's bad detective work to include a couple of nods that Armstrong gave in the interview in her arrest affidavit? Do you agree with that? She nods after Connor mentioned that surveillance footage had captured Armstrong's vehicle parked in the vicinity of the house, where about an hour and a half later on May 11, Wilson was found dead. I actually didn't know that. I didn't actually know that they captured Armstrong's vehicle parked near the house, and an hour and a half later, Wilson was found dead. In other words, an hour and a half before that, they said that surveillance footage captured her vehicle parked in the vicinity. So that is definitely extending our knowledge base a little bit. That is definitely extending our knowledge base. In other words, according to what law enforcement are saying, at around about 7 p.m., they think that Caitlin's car, the Jeep, was parked close to Cash's home. That's quite interesting. That's quite a long time. If it stayed there for an hour and a half. Did it stay there for an hour and a half? But the point here is that when they confronted Kaitlin with this contention, they say that she nodded. She nodded when this was said. Is that a fact? Like I'm not sure I knew about that. Is that a fact? If you have that as a fact, can you try and find a source for that? Because I didn't know that her car was seen driving past the day before. I've certainly learned something here. That's something I definitely missed, the hour and a half aspect. So think about this whole idea, is her nodding, and that is then mentioned in the affidavit, is that stepping out of line, right? In terms of a narrative, is it wrong to say we said this and she nodded, while you've broken the protocol of affidavits? Let's tear the affidavit up. Or do you think that that should be said? So Sharon says a nod could mean I heard you. That's a good point. That is a good point. Zircon says aren't nods an answer? Can you see where it's going into that area of speculation, which is where you've got to be very careful? And as far as I know, Kofa's an ex-prosecutor. So Kofa himself would know himself, probably saying to law enforcement, hey, don't speculate in the affidavit. Now he's kind of playing devil's advocate. Where's speculation? Where's even a hint of speculation in the affidavit, right? And this is borderline speculating that the nod means something, right? But I think if you take it on its own merits, it's quite interesting. And that's what we're going to do now. Let's take it on its own merits. We see a similar reference in the Watts discovery, where Tammy Lee references Watts sniffing. This is the discovery, though, not the affidavit, where she mentions Watts sniffing when they mention him not shedding a tear. She says something like, you have not shed one tear, and Coda sort of supports her saying that. And then shortly after that, he makes some kind of indignant statement and kind of goes, and it sounds like he's trying to seem emotional. And then that is reported in the discovery because it is relevant. And I think it was true. Of course, again, that's discovery, not the affidavit. Even so, the Watts affidavit contains untrue statements such as this. So I want to come back to this idea. If there's a flaw in your affidavit, does that give you the right to tear it up and throw it away? If there's a flaw in your affidavit, does that give you the right to just throw out the whole investigation? Oh, I made a spelling mistake, affidavit gone, case dismissed. Chris Watts, let's get you back, get back into Frederick. We need you. Sorry, we made a big mistake in the affidavit. Come, you can get out of jail. Look at what it says here. After being allowed to speak with his father, Chris stated, this is from the affidavit, that he told Shanann he wanted a separation, and he walked downstairs for a moment, and then he returned to his bedroom to speak with Shanann again. While in the bedroom by a baby monitor, he observed Bella sprawled and all of this, right? He also said he loaded all three bodies onto the back seat of his work truck. Right now, we know most of this isn't true. So in hindsight, can't we tear up the affidavit and get Chris Watts out of jail? Because we know now that this is wrong. Bella wasn't sprawled. All of this that he said that he saw didn't happen. Can't you say that this is speculation? I think you can. You can say that. So because there's some speculation here, can you tear up this affidavit and let's get Chris Watts back out of jail? Of course not. But there are certain things that were indisputable in terms of the affidavit. The other thing that we would later find out was that the CCTV from the neighbor would show that this wasn't correct either about the loading all three bodies. But Chris Watts, if he was more of an astute guy, and if he had the means to hire a good lawyer, they could have attacked this part of the affidavit, right? All I'm saying is this idea that an affidavit is absolutely flawless is it's an irrational standard, and it's easy to come to it in hindsight, long time after the fact. At the time, they had the facts that they had. It's easy to come to it months and months later and say, oh, that's an obvious mistake. You made such an obvious mistake. No. wasn't so obvious at the time, right? And it's not because of incompetence at the time. It's not because of inexperience at the time. That is how much of the mosaic you knew, right? 4 years later, it's easy to say, yeah, we knew about the CCTV and we knew about this and we knew about that. It's not so easy when you are on day 1 or day 2 of the case, right? Does that make sense? Like, does that put the two affidavits into perspective? I don't think you can find a flaw in an affidavit and say that gives you the right to throw the baby out with the bathwater. The point of the affidavit is to formally legalize a claim. Some claims may have a stronger basis than others, but the claim itself shouldn't be seen as the actual trial. And that's the biggest problem I've got with all of this is stop putting the affidavit on trial, put the suspect on trial. Stop putting the affidavit on trial. Stop putting law enforcement on trial. Let's have a trial. For goodness sake, let's have a trial. The point of the affidavit is to formally legalize a claim. And so it's making certain reinforcing arguments and statements. And some of those may have more merit than others. And put together, is there some merit to that claim, yes or no? You don't say, well, there are 10 arguments saying that there's some merit to the claim, but 3 of them don't have any merit and are actually incorrect, so you don't have any merit whatsoever. No. You say, in sum, it looks like there's some merit to what is being alleged. That's what you say. Double Rainbow says, I learned a lot today. That's great to hear. This is quite, if you think about it, it's quite high level analysis dealing with legal standards, legal protocols. It's not just, I don't know, what do you call it? Just waffling on what I think and what blah, blah, blah. You know, it's not that. It's an educated way of looking at some very sharp minds and how they are prosecuting or defending a case and the merits to that. It's a legal analysis. It's not a true crime analysis so much. It's true crime, but it's a legal analysis within that. Some claims, as I say, have a stronger basis than others. So, for example, inside of this nonsense from the affidavit, inside of this nonsense is he identifies that site, which is true. A lot of these other statements here aren't true, but the factual thing is Survey 319, GPS coordinates that, and he said he buried Shanann and that the girls were there and they were there. If you just took those 2 sentences, that would be enough. In terms of this arrest affidavit, if you just took those sentences, Chris said he buried Shanann near 2 oil tanks and dumped the girls inside the oil tanks, and you provide those GPS coordinates, that would be enough. You wouldn't need to say anything more than that. What is above that is actually false. He said he told Shanann he wanted a separation that morning. I don't believe that's true. He walked downstairs for a moment after he said that, then he returned to the bedroom. I don't think that's true. That's just what he said being repeated in the affidavit. You can speculate whether that's true or not. It doesn't belong in the affidavit. It's clear that that doesn't belong now. While in the bedroom, blah, 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 I observed this, that, all of that is very likely not true. So in that short paragraph, probably 10%, maybe a little bit more, 20% is factual, is true. Most of that paragraph is untrue. So should you say, okay, we shouldn't put out an arrest affidavit? No. So you can have flaws in affidavit. You can have flaws. And I would say the earlier an affidavit comes out, the more flaws a judge needs to say, you know what, I'm going to give you guys a little bit of leeway here, because you couldn't have known that. You did have reason, or you didn't have reason. You were hamstrung by certain people that you expected or hoped or thought would be forthcoming, and then they weren't. The other thing that I think is totally pertinent in this case is you say, is this a case where witnesses have come forward and people have been contributing what they know, and you've been getting, it's been quite easy to get witness statements in this case? And I think the answer would be, this has been a particularly difficult case to get that. Why? Because it's professional athletes, and professional athletes are all trying to protect their brands and their reputations, and professional athletes are brand ambassadors, and they don't want their brands to be associated with negative publicity, and a murder trial is as negative as publicity gets. I dealt with that in the Oscar Pistorius case, where that was something he didn't want to lose either. And so someone who wants to come forward, well, if your job is related to publicity to a large extent, then are you going to want to come forward? And I think the same applies in the Johnny Depp Amber Heard case. Certain celebrities that may have wanted to support either Johnny Depp or Amber Heard may have felt, I'm rather going to just say nothing, because I've also got to protect my celebrity status. There are things I know, but I'm not going to come forward because because this whole case is negative publicity. I would love to come forward. I'd love to say something. I know something, but I don't want to, because what about my income, right? Thanks a lot, BM. I really appreciate that. Can you see how this element adds a level of intrigue to a case that should be, one would imagine, fairly simple? This element of all the witnesses in this area, potential witnesses, having their own exposure to some extent. Now, there's another case in South Africa, the Jason Roeder case, where a real estate agent, he was like the CEO, he was accused of killing his wife at a business convention, right? So there was a kind of a business meeting at a hotel where all of his employees were gathered. And at that particular event, he was accused of murdering his wife, and also a situation of he was having an affair, and he was supposedly having an affair with one of his staff or one of the employees. And the impression that you kind of got was, did he not think that no one would testify against him because they basically worked for him? So in other words, you would have once again a problem with witnesses, wouldn't you, in a situation like that, where the suspect has all of these people in the situation that are actually his employees, right? And so the other thing you could say is, how could someone commit a crime in a situation like that at a hotel and think he could get away with it? Well, isn't that potentially an answer to that? Is that, well, because doesn't he own the playing field, right? It's a question. Doesn't he own that playing field? And I'm just saying, isn't that a similar situation here, where professional athletes can't afford to come forward and say what they know because they'd be associated with negative publicity, and that then helps the defense? Does it help the defense? It's a question. Okay. Coming back to the Chris Watts case, did they know that the CCTV would eventually come out showing that Shanann could not have killed the children in the house, as the affidavit alleged had happened, right? This is also from the Watts affidavit, right? Chris said at approximately 5:27 a.m. that he backed his work truck into the driveway. I think that's even an error. That is, I think that should be 5:18 a.m., right? So should you say there's an error in the affidavit, tear it up, Chris Watts, you're free to go? You guys are unprofessional. You guys are inexperienced cops. You made a mistake getting the right time there. So that didn't happen. Chris Watts didn't back his truck up. So let's tear up the affidavit. Off you go. Thanks, Chris. Thanks for your time. You're free to go. There's another error in the affidavit. So this idea that you can't make any errors in the affidavit, or you don't know how to write affidavits. My experience, literally my first-hand experience in South Africa, where things happen, the affidavits I've seen are written terribly. They're spelling mistakes. They are just like, I actually feel like saying, whoa, stop. Let me write it. I'll write it and you can sign it. I don't know if that's legal, but that's just a feeling you get. Or do you mind if I type it out? Because you type really, really slowly. I'll type out the affidavit. It's my statement after all. I've seen some really, really terrible affidavits. So to hold this high standard that they've got to be perfectly executed narratives worthy of the Booker Prize is flippin' absurd. It's an absurd level of, it's just totally absurd. I just want to confirm this because I could be wrong. I seem to remember Chris Watts backed out at 5:18 a.m. That's how I remember it. 5:27 a.m. I thought it was 5:18. Let's see if I can get some confirmation on that. Can't seem to find it. I don't like to make statements that I can't actually sort of verify. If I had the affidavit with me, it's unfortunately on my other computer, sorry, the Discovery. But unfortunately, a lot of the news stories covering this just don't cover things like the exact time, unfortunately. Just wish I could find that time. It's starting to bother me. So, I mean, look at this article. It says he left for work around 5:30 a.m. I mean, that's even more vague. Definitely even more vague. I'm trying to find 5:18 a.m. with Chris Watts. Someone else gives it at 5:15 a.m. But that is, I think, a bit more, a bit closer to the time. Let's just get to that section. August 13, there we go. There, 5:15 a.m. That's also not right. As far as I know, it's 5:18 a.m. 5:18 a.m. I still want to get the 5:18. I'm sorry, I'm just quite fixated on that right now. The details do matter. Let's see if I can get it somewhere else. I'm sorry to get stuck on this, but I wrote quite a few books on this, so I sort of feel like I really want to be sure. I think I found it. I know that's something else. Can't believe this is so hard to find. As I say, if I had the discovery, that would be quite simple. Comprehensive case timeline. $8:13. This might have it. There we go. At last. Okay, so this is from Reddit, and it's giving the comprehensive case timeline, and there it says 5:18 Chris starts his work truck. That's actually not accurate. Backs his truck into the driver. That's not accurate. He started his work truck and then immediately backed it up. So that's actually incorrect. I think that's a reference to the discovery. But anyway, there you go. I just always feel like I don't like saying something factual like that you may not agree with without proving that it's factual. Because the details do matter. Yeah. So the point that all of that was about was to say there is a affidavit that's reporting a factual aspect incorrectly. Sorry, it's not that. It's not that either. It's this. At approximately 5:27, he backed his truck. That's not actually accurate. It's actually 5:18, right? Believe me, it is 5:18. Thanks a lot for joining, Marcus, right? So the fact that it's not factual doesn't mean you tear up the affidavit. That was a long way of getting really to that point, right? Okay. So it's interesting to me how hard defense attorneys seem to try to avoid getting cases to go to trial, where if it was such a simple and obvious matter that their clients were innocent, bear in mind what Kofa said, this is all fictitious, it's misogynist, the state's own evidence will exonerate my client. I think it's stuff like the CCTV of the vehicle doesn't even show the number plate. It seems like it's so easy and so obvious. Well, why not simply take it to trial? If this was a sure-fire win for you, think about how attorneys think. It's almost like boxers. I want to take part in this contest because then I can say I've got 10 knockouts in a row. Now I've got 20 knockouts in a row, right? Lawyers are the same. I'm a criminal defense attorney. My record is 19 out of 20 victories. The only one that I lost was a mistrial, whatever, right? Lawyers want the same record. They want to go to a client and say, I took on 100 cases, I've only lost 2, or I've never lost a case. So if this was a case you can win, you want to take it to trial because you can win it, right? You can win it. So why does it feel like there's this feeling of, I don't want to take the case to trial? I mean, or does he? I don't know. So if you feel strongly, if it is so simple, Why not just take it to trial and get it over with neatly and quickly? Why all of these motions and all of these arguments and this struggle, this limping process to get the case to trial? Wasn't there a sense that 6 months ago we thought that this case would be heard 6 months later, like by now? Wasn't there a sense that it was going to be fast-tracked? So the defense attorney earns a nice notch on his belt if he can say, I've got so many wins versus so many losses. So if this is such a simple case to win, why not take it to trial? Now, in the 131-page Morphew affidavit, now we're talking about Kaitlin nodding, that whole thing. There are references to Barry looking down at a bobcat. I think where your evidence is thin, I do think you need to add more details. This is from that particular part of the Morphew affidavit, right? S.A. Grusing asked Barry to show pins, and Barry is recorded. This is like quite incredible narrative on its own. He talks about that, and then Barry said the guns are the most important. That's what he wants back. And then over here he says, Barry points to a pin, and he didn't even realize that. Barry states that when that happens, and so on. And then somewhere around here, I mean, they've even got photos of Barry in the situation where they're talking about him looking at that, right? I'm just going to close my window for a second. Hold on. Okay, I am going to wrap up soon after this. We've passed the 2-hour mark. I don't like going much more than that. But the part that I want to highlight is this thing of all this detail. Barry starts talking about the cutting edge. Barry says he thinks that the Trent blade, this and that. But there is a point in this particular section where they talk about Barry looked down and Barry moved his foot this side or that side. You can make the same argument. Why are you saying that in the affidavit? Why are you speculating in the affidavit, right? Now, think about this in a kind of a human way, but let's first deal with Kaitlin. The affidavit states that Detective Connor then confronted Armstrong on how seeing her vehicle in the area, coupled with the statements made by Strickland, made things not look too good. Armstrong then again nodded her head up and down as if in agreement, right? So what they don't like is that the affidavit seems to be speculating that nodding means it seems like she's agreeing, right? What Kaitlin's defense of finding absolutely an abomination is the idea that where she goes like this, oh my God, are you saying that she's agreeing to that? Oh, how the hell could you make that assumption? That's a bridge too far. I don't think you've written that very well. You know, it's really unacceptable. Now, I want you guys to think about this aspect. That's why I say kind of make it human. If someone presents an argument that you were or could have been close to a murder scene, right? Put yourself in that situation. You are at a police station and someone is saying, we saw your car by that murder scene. Are you going to just sit there? You didn't commit a murder. And let's say also your car wasn't anywhere near the area, because that's also what Kof is saying, is that CCTV is not her vehicle, or you can't prove that that's her. You can't see behind the tinted glass, and you can't prove the license plate. It seems to be saying Yeah, but that doesn't mean it's her, meaning maybe it's not her. Maybe she wasn't even near there, right? So if you say you are at a police station, someone says, we saw your car, there was a murder right there, we saw your car right there, we're trying to say you were right there. Would you just sit there? So Terry says nodding can also be to diffuse a situation. Not here, but I've done it. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm saying if you're implicated in a murder, right, and you haven't committed this murder, right? You haven't committed this murder, and someone is saying that it looks like you did because you were in the area. So you're in a situation where someone is saying your car was really close to a murder, ... Would you just go, I wouldn't. I'd say, no, I didn't. I was actually at home. I was working. I wasn't driving there. And anyway, my car's got that over there and that over there. If someone said, it looks like you may have committed a murder, I don't think I would go, I think I would say, no, I didn't kill anyone. And let me give you some information. Here's my phone. I was there. Whatever. Right. In fact, I can tell you, when my girlfriend came, this is a fact. When my girlfriend came to pick up her cat at my home, like I said, I would bring her cat to her, but she ended up coming to my home, and it was in the dark, and she was running after her cat in the dark, through the garden in the dark. And I kind of said, don't run after the cat will run away from you. If you stand still, the cat will come to us. She ended up running after the cat. While she was running after the cat, she fell down. She kind of fell down some stairs, like 3 stairs. And I think what was sort of like in the air is like, did you push her down, or was she running away from you, or something like that, right? And when I told friends the story, I said, well, actually, I was at her car with my garage door open, saying, just stand over here, the cat will come to us. The cat was here earlier, right? And so that same thing of, well, I'm aware that there might be that question, where were you when she fell, or what were you doing when she fell? And so you go into that area and you say, you know what, I wasn't there. I was actually standing somewhere else. And she complained and said, I didn't come to her aid soon enough. She'd fallen, and I didn't come to her aid soon enough. And then I was blamed for that, right? But what I'm trying to say is, when that sort of silence surrounds this idea of, could you have done something that's not very nice, and you just remain silent, I wouldn't remain silent. I would say, no, I was nowhere near there. I was not even in the area, right? That's in terms of something like that. Now, when someone is murdered, would you really not try and defend yourself, right? I mean, if you didn't do something, why wouldn't you deny it? Because by not denying it, aren't you saying, what are you saying? By not denying something, what are you saying? So he says, a person who remains silent, that's not an admission of guilt. Technically, that's a true statement, but I don't know if it's a fundamentally true statement. Like, I don't know if you can say, every time someone remains silent is an admission of guilt. In the same way, you could say someone who's talking isn't an admission of innocence, like with Chris Watts. In fact, I think they often talk so that it appears to be innocence. They don't get a lawyer so that it appears to be innocent. So Deaton seems to be an expert in human psychology here. But I think the flip side is how many criminal cases you see murder suspects not taking the stand in their own defense, right? So you say, take those words, a person who remains silent is not an admission of guilt. Well, what about Chris Watts at his sentencing hearing? He didn't say anything. Let me say that again. A person who remains silent, that's not an admission of guilt. Chris Watts at his sentencing hearing, he didn't say anything. They were making terrible accusations about him, terrible things about what he did to his wife and his children, terrible things about couldn't you just get a divorce? Terrible statements like, this is the worst crime I've seen in 17 years or whatever it was. People are saying terrible statements about you. Well, if they're not true, why wouldn't you stand up and say they're not true? Brian Laundrie, yeah. Double Rainbow says, I would have vehemently denied it if I were innocent, and very verbally, not merely nodding, right? I'm trying to say to you, if someone accused you of murder and said, this looks like your car, wouldn't you say something? Or would you just be like, oh, okay, you're accusing me, okay. Or would you, if you didn't do it, wouldn't you say something? Wouldn't most people say something? I think another side to the remaining silent part is, aren't you waiting for more information? Someone saying, we've got this information about your car. We think this. Can you understand that it looks this way? Right? And I think what he's saying is, she's nodding to acknowledge that that's the end of the sentence. But the flip side of that is, someone is innocent in this situation. Wouldn't you say something? Also, wouldn't you want to say something about Colin? Wouldn't you want to say, why did you guys talk to him? What did he say? Wouldn't you be curious? If you're the closest person in your life, the person you were living with, has just been spoken to also by law enforcement about a murder, wouldn't you want to know about that? Wouldn't you have questions? Wouldn't it be odd not to have questions about that? Let me again explain this intertextually. Look how many criminal cases you see murder suspects not taking the stand in their own defense. Chris Watts, O.J. Simpson, Casey Anthony. As far as I know, neither of the Ramsey parents testified during the grand jury phase either. When Kate McCann was asked 48 questions at a Portuguese police statement, she elected to remain silent. Right? Not long after, this is going back to this article, not long after Armstrong left the police station, she sold her car and made her way to Costa Rica on her sister's passport. Prosecutors said in court Wednesday. Police tracked her down and in late June arrested her there. Additionally, Deaton said that police should have described the type of residence where Wilson was found dead, an apartment situated above a residential garage. Okay, I'm going to wrap up now, but this is the part where I've really got to scoff. I've really got to scoff at this part. So this is badly written because you didn't say that she was found in an apartment situated above a garage. It's another indicator of sloppy police work and inexperienced detectives. Because they didn't describe the the residence in that much detail, that's another criticism. Isn't that nitpicking? Wouldn't you guys say that's nitpicking? I'm not sure if they ever described the Watts home on Saratoga Trail as a standalone residence or a two-story residence, or larger than the adjacent houses, or that it was painted brown. So just don't do that. So, can you see how it feels like nitpicking? It feels like it's undermining things that really aren't all that material, right? Yeah, they seem to be grasping at nothing. Lisa Stokes says she was keeping quiet because she knew they had her. Then they let her go. Well, that's speculation, but it does seem odd. I don't think you can get away from the fact that being in this situation and being told what somebody thinks seems quite strange that you would not say anything. If you take that psychology, you take the psychology of, and this is speculation, if you take this psychology of the anonymous callers saying that they thought they saw someone shaking with rage, that they saw someone reacting, that they thought they saw someone reactionary and emotional, right? On the topic of someone possibly being unfaithful, right? And you juxtapose that with someone being confronted with the possibility of being accused of murder, just nodding quietly. I think someone described her as being as cool as the pillow on the other side of the bed. Do they go together? The one seems like quite a reactionary, emotional person. The other one seems the opposite, like not reacting when you think maybe they could or should, not being emotional when you think anyone would. What does one make of that? Interesting comment there. So I'm not going to take it further than that. I hope you guys have found this analysis worthwhile. We haven't really gotten into the transcript, but we will continue with that in episode 5. There's quite a lot to go through in that transcript, and then we'll see if there's more information that comes to light. Obviously, we will be looking out for the judgment, the response of the judge to these motions. And obviously, this is all designed to suppress evidence. That's the point of it. We will look at the judge's response 2 to 3 weeks from now, on the 9th of November. So look out for that. Again, if you're worried that this case is going to go the route of the Barry Morphew case, I wouldn't be that worried. On the one hand, Kof is a great lawyer and he shouldn't be underestimated, but this is not anywhere near the challenges faced by the Morphew case. It's not quite the same thing. I would say that APD, Austin Police Department, must learn the lessons from the botched prosecution of the Suzanne Morphew case. Don't make those same mistakes. I would say that. Lisa says, as always, a great live. Thanks, guys. Timmy, thank you. Thanks a lot to everybody here. If you are in LA or California, I think must be about, is it about 10 o'clock at night? Terry, is it about 10 p.m. there? It's getting late is the point. So I hope you guys do have a good sleep. Marcus says, happy to have caught this live. As usual, very thought-provoking. Thanks for that. Joanna says, enjoyed it very much. Always great content on this channel. Just a quick announcement. I'm doing TCRS book club tomorrow. Let me just make sure that that's right. Well, let me just say Wednesday. On Wednesday, and I'll be interviewing an American author. That's the author of this book, Flatwater Tuesday. We're going to be interviewing him. It's an American author. I've met him. We've kind of shared our writer's journey to some extent, and I'm going to take you through something that I'm very envious of, the fairy tale of a writer who gets a publishing contract. I think he even got a movie deal, who got his book very well reviewed. He wrote a great book, and we're going to find out about his journey. And we're going to explore a very interesting territory that's also true in true crime. What impact does high school have on you as an adult, right? And think about the impact high school had on certain people in true crime. Did it have an influence? Casey Anthony, Shanann Watts. Think about Jeffrey Dahmer. Did the formative years in a particular person's life, did that lead to dysfunction later on? Does what happened in high school affect your adult life? Did it affect your life? I know it affected mine. So we're going to deal with how Ron Irwin deals with that theme, that topic in this book, and why he chose to write about it. Ron himself, I think, was an oarsman. So I think a lot of this book is based on a true story. So that's also what we want to know, is how much of Flatwater Tuesday is based on his real experience. Another good movie that deals with just how formative and foundational high school can be in life is the movie Dead Poets Society with Robin Williams, one of the best movies I think I've ever seen. It covers that subject matter. So if you haven't ever sat in on a TCRS book club, don't miss this one. It'll be tomorrow at, I think it's 4 p.m. Eastern time. Make sure you don't miss it. Ron will also be telling us about a new book that is coming out. And then also, he's an American that can tell you what life is like in South Africa, because he's worked as a lecturer at a university. And we're going to talk about the writing journey and his writing journey and the books that are coming out. And yeah, what the fairy tale is when you've got an agent, when you get a publishing contract, when people treat you like an author that has authority, that knows what he's doing. And also, what was the hard part? How hard is it writing a book? How hard was it writing Flatwater Tuesday? How hard was it writing the book that is just written? So we'll deal with all of that. Okay, so again, thanks everyone. Thanks a lot to the mods. Terry Dean, is Sharon still here? But also to the members, to the new members, to the new subs. Also, thanks a lot for the super chats. Remember, if you're listening to this on replay, you can hit the thanks button. I will be continuing coverage of this case. We'll be continuing to go through the transcript over the next days. So if you're interested in this case and you haven't subscribed, make sure you do. And I'll see you guys next time. Take care.